Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Peah. We're up to Perek Aleph Mishnah Daled. The Mishnah now is going to list 5 different conditions that need to be met in order for a crop to be obligated in Peah. There are 5 separate conditions. Klal Amru Peah. There is a rule regarding Peah. Kol Shu Ochel, any crop that is a food, normally eaten by people, that's number 1. V'nishmar, it is protected, that's number 2. V'gidulav min haaretz, it grows from the ground, number 3. Ulkitato ke'achat, it is gathered at once, that's 4. Umachniso lekiyum, it is brought in for storage, that's 5. Chayav bepe'ah, that is obligated in pe'ah. V'atvuah ve'kitniot baknal ze, included in this rule all types of grains and beans that they need to have the 5 conditions to be obligated in pe'ah. Let us run through the Mishnah again. Now, klal amru b'pe'ah, there is a rule regarding pe'ah. Kol shu ochel, any crop that is food, normally eaten by people, is one of the conditions to be obligated in pe'ah. Now, the Rav writes that this excludes something edible, such as a certain herb that they used to make for dye, which is eaten by people in emergencies. The source of this ruling is that the Torah says, "Ufkutzrechem et kitzir artzechem," when you reap the harvest of your land. Now, the word liktzor, to reap, it's used for crops that are meant as food for people. Therefore, that's condition number 1. It has to be a normally edible food for people. Number 2, the condition is nishmal, it is protected. Meaning, the Rav writes, it's privately owned, so the owner protects it. This excludes ownerless crops which are not protected. Therefore, they're not obligated in pe'ah. How do we know the source for this? The Rav says, the Torah writes, Le'ani v'lager ta'azovotam. You shall leave the leftover crop, the corner, for the poor and the stranger. That excludes ownerless crops which are already left for the poor and for the strangers. Therefore, condition number 2 is that it has to be protected. It's an owned field. So it's owned, privately owned. Number 3, gidulav min haaretz, it grows from the ground. That excludes foods like mushrooms. They're attached to the ground, but no roots. They get their nourishment from the air, not from the ground. Therefore, they don't grow on the ground. And again, the source for this ruling is the Torah says you have to leave pe'ah when you eat the harvest of your land. That excludes things that don't grow on the land, which are mushrooms. Number 4, we said likitato ke'achat, it is gathered in at once. The Rav writes this means that the entire crop ripens and is harvested at the same time, which excludes crops like figs, where each tree ripens and is picked at different times. Now again, the source of this ruling is, it says liktzor, when you harvest, that implies that you're harvesting a large amount at the same time, cutting and gathering a large amount at the same time, which does not apply to figs because they're each done individually when they're ready. Number 5 is machniso lekiyum. It is brought in for storage, which the Rav explains is that food that lasts in storage is what's obligated in pe'ah, excluding different types of vegetables which will spoil if they are put in storage. And the reason for this is because, again, the Torah says, liktzor, kitzir, harvesting. Harvesting is something that is brought into storage, which excludes, we said, some vegetables that spoil. The Mishnah says, chayav b'pe'ah, only if you have these 5 conditions are you obligated in pe'ah. V'atvuah v'kitniot, b'klal ze, included in this rule are types of grains and beans that the Rav writes, even though you might have thought that since Ketzir applies to grain and beans, and you would have thought that they don't have to have 5 because that's the definition of harvesting, grains and beans. Therefore, the Mishnah comes and tells you that even grains and beans have to have these 5 conditions in order to be obligated in pe'ah, and even if one of the conditions is missing, they are not obligated in pe'ah anymore. That is Mishnah Daled. Mishnah Hey Rabotai discusses which trees are obligated in pe'ah. Uba ilan, regarding trees, ha'og, v'cheruvin, the sumac tree and carob's tree, va'egozim, v'ashkedim, the walnuts and almonds, v'gifanim, v'rimonim, grapevines and pomegranates, v'azetim, v'tmarim, and olives and dates, chayvim bepe'ah, they are obligated in pe'ah. Now the Rav writes, these 8 trees are examples of the 5 conditions that we spoke about previously. Any other tree that has all 5 is also obligated in pe'ah. The Mishnah was just giving us 8 trees that have all 5 conditions. Now, why isn't a fig tree included in this list? Because we said in the previous Mishnah, figs are exempt from pe'ah since they cannot be gathered at once, because each have their own harvest time and ripening time. And one of the conditions was it has to be gathered at once. That is the end of today's Mishna Yomi, Rabotai. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.